If I asked you right now to think about who you were 10 years ago, or maybe even just 5 years ago,
Mm,
would you really recognize that person?
it's a tough question.
It really is. Because for a lot of us, I think the answer is often a pretty resounding maybe. I mean, you were in a different job, a different city. Maybe you had a whole different set of friends.
Or even, and this is the big one, fundamentally opposing beliefs and values.
Exactly. We use these phrases all the time, right? Like,
Yeah.
I'm not the same person I was back then.
Or that event, becoming a parent or losing someone or changing careers, it changed me completely.
I became someone else.
Yeah.
We say that. We use that exact language to acknowledge these deep, transformative, sometimes really radical changes that life puts us through.
And that profound sense of discontinuity, that feeling of being a new person, that's perfectly true to our psychological experience of change. But, and this is the paradox, we simultaneously operate our entire lives based on an assumption that completely contradicts that idea
We use the language of continuity.
all the time.
So that's the tension.
That's exactly it. I mean, think about justice. We say things like, I regret what I did years ago. That phrase, right there, immediately implies that the person who did the thing in the past,
Right.
the person holding the memory of it, and the person who feels the regret now are one and the same entity, a single I that we track from childhood through our teenage years right up to this very moment.
And we make these huge life plans based on it. Promises that only make sense if that continuity is real.
Totally. I will retire at 65. Or one day I'll be old. The person making that plan is relying completely on the idea that the future person who gets to enjoy retirement will still, in some essential way, be them.
So we've got these two competing truths just living side by side in our heads. We feel like a totally new person on Tuesday, but on Wednesday, we're counting on being the exact same person to get our pension.
It's a fundamental conflict.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because if you take these two common yet, completely contradictory ways of thinking about ourselves, it forces us to face this core philosophical puzzle. Are you fundamentally one and the same person from the moment you're born until the moment you die?
Or,
Or do you constantly dissolve and just become someone new, connected only by this, I don't know, this loose causal thread to the person you were yesterday?
that tension you just laid out, that is precisely what philosophers have been debating for millennia. We call it the problem of personal identity over time.
And it sounds like it's a pretty ancient puzzle.
Maybe the most ancient puzzle in human thought. It sits right at the intersection of three huge fields. First, you've got metaphysics, which is asking, what are things, essentially? What's the substance of a self?
Okay.
Second is ethics, which deals with responsibility, justice, all the moral claims we make across time.
And the third.
And third is psychology, which of course focuses on how we actually experience and construct that feeling of self on the inside.
So that junction, that complex intersection, that is our mission statement for this deep dive. We are going to explore the competing and, sometimes conflicting answers that thinkers have come up with for this central defining question. What makes a person at one time the same person as a person at another? Vastly different time.
And we really need to emphasize this right from the start.
Yeah.
This is not just some, theoretical mind game for academics in an ivory tower. This puzzle has crucial, tangible, real-world consequences for you, for how society works, and for how you navigate your own life and commitments.
Let's look at the stakes here, because they really are profound. I think the most obvious one has to be moral responsibility.
Without a doubt.
So imagine a person who committed a really serious, violent crime 20 years ago. But since then, through extensive rehabilitation, genuine remorse, time, and just profound personal work, maybe even literal changes in their brain, their character, their whole disposition, their values are now completely different.
Psychologically, they're almost a different person.
Right. So what do we do with that?
Well, that's the core ethical challenge. If we
Yeah.
decide to adopt, say, a purely psychological view of identity, which we'll get into later, we might be tempted to say the original criminal just doesn't exist anymore.
That a new person is now living in that body.
Exactly. But if you claim the person is totally new, you immediately undermine the foundation of our entire justice system. The whole thing relies on the continuity of the offender. We hold people responsible now for crimes they committed years ago because we fundamentally believe they are the same person.
And this is where a philosopher like John Locke comes in, right?
Yeah.
He argued that identity really just follows consciousness and memory.
He did. And if you take his model seriously, it gets very tricky. If that person, 20 years later, genuinely has no conscious memory or psychological link to the criminal act, maybe through amnesia or just a total psychological break.
Then Locke's model would suggest that the identity has actually shifted, that they're not the same moral agent anymore.
Precisely. And that clashes directly with society's need for long-term responsibility and, well, punishment. The system demands we see continuity, even when the person's own psychology might not support it.
That tension is a massive problem.
Yeah.
And it doesn't stop with the law, does it? It stretches right into our deepest relationships.
It absolutely does. Let's talk about commitments and promises. Just think about a marriage vow.
Forever.
Forever. When you stand up and you promise to love someone forever, we all know it's aspirational, but the assumption baked into that promise is perfect, absolute continuity.
But the I making that promise is just a specific snapshot in time, right? It's a particular set of psychological traits, chemical balances, life experiences.
And the you in 30 years will also be fundamentally changed. Their values might be different. Their brain structure will have been altered by decades of life.
So how can a commitment made by one version of yourself truly bind a future altered version?
That's the question. Our ability to keep promises, to maintain long-term relationships, it relies entirely on this premise that enough of the essential, whatever that is, persists to honor the original deal.
Even when it's really inconvenient or difficult for the current version of you.
Especially then. The stability of all our social contracts, our friendships, legal agreements, our role in a community, it all depends on the idea that we are continuous beings.
Okay, so let's bring it right down to the individual, to the person listening to this right now. The stake of self-improvement and personal growth.
Right. When you decide to work on yourself, you start a new painful habit, you quit a lifelong addiction, or you commit to learning something new like you're doing right now, who exactly are you trying to change? Who are you trying to become?
Am I trying to change a future me or an evolved me?
It's a crucial distinction. When you look back at a version of yourself you're ashamed of, do you treat them like some alien entity whose mess you have to clean up? Or do you see them as a continuous part of your journey that you have to integrate?
Because if identity is fixed and rigid, then improvement is really just about, what, polishing the existing statue.
Exactly. But if identity is constantly changing, as some views suggest, then self-improvement is basically an act of self-creation. The current you is actively designing and building a future you that doesn't even exist yet.
And choosing between those two frameworks, polishing the old selves or creating a new one, that fundamentally changes how you approach growth, discipline, even how you handle failure.
It dictates everything. It dictates how much faith you're willing to put in the person who's going to exist 20 years from now.
Okay, so now that we've established just how high the stakes are, let's dive into the classic attempts to find some kind of stable anchor for identity.
We can start with what we call the substance-based views, the idea that something fixed, something singular and persistent carries your identity all the way through time.
This sounds like the search for the unchanging core of a person.
It is. And the first, and historically probably the most pervasive answer, is the soul view. This perspective, which is central to so much of global thought, basically says that what makes you the same person over time is the simple fact that you have the same soul.
So an immaterial spiritual substance that acts as your unchanging core identity.
Exactly. So we're talking about a non-physical component here. It's the constant, persistent carrier of you, regardless of all the wear and tear on your physical body or the internal shifts in your beliefs and feelings.
It's the thing that stays the same.
The one thing that stays the same, the components of this view are really clear and kind of elegant. The soul is defined as a simple, indivisible, non-material thing.
Okay.
And crucially, it persists. It persists even as your body goes through radical physical change, cells replacing themselves, your appearance aging, getting injured. It also persists when your inner mental life, your fleeting thoughts, your shifting opinions, your emotions, they just come and go. The soul is supposed to remain fixed, unchanging, and perfectly continuous underneath all that surface-level chaos.
That structure seems very neat. It gives you a perfect, simple answer. Same soul equals same person. And you can see why that has resonated so deeply throughout history.
Tremendously so. I mean, its biggest strength is how well it aligns with these vast cultural, philosophical, and religious traditions.
Yeah.
Judaism, Christianity, Islam, the basic ideas of Platonic dualism in Western thought. The strengths are really compelling.
It gives you that clear, non-physical carrier for identity that doesn't have to rely on something unreliable like memory or something transient like the atoms in your body.
And it also seamlessly supports beliefs about an afterlife or reincarnation or karma, because that essential non-material essence is by definition capable of persisting beyond the physical death of the organism.
And for the individual, on a personal level, it explains that deep internal feeling of sameness.
That's maybe the most important part. Even when you look at a photo of yourself as a kid and you barely recognize the clothes or the context, there's that persistent, powerful inner sense that the fundamental the me is still there. The soul view tries to give that feeling an anchor.
But there's
Yep.
always a but.
Always a but.
This view faces some really thorny philosophical challenges, mostly because it's proposing a solution that's non-observable and non-material.
The challenges are significant. The first one is what we call the knowledge problem.
How do you know it's there?
Exactly. If the soul is non-material, how can we prove its existence, let alone its persistence over time? It evades any kind of scientific observation, measurement, or empirical test. So if you can't independently verify that the soul exists or that it's continuous, then basing your whole idea of identity on it becomes an act of faith, not philosophical certainty.
Okay, but let's just assume for a moment that the soul does exist. We immediately run into that classic mind-body problem, the interaction problem.
This is a devastating challenge for any kind of dualistic view. If the soul is immaterial, meaning it has no mass, no location, no measurable physical properties, how can it possibly influence the physical brain, which is purely material?
And how can physical things happening in the brain, an injury, a drug, influence the state of the non-physical soul?
It's a huge gap. I recall the philosopher René Descartes struggled profoundly with this.
He did, didn't he?
He did. He famously tried to solve it by locating the point of interaction in the pineal gland, but that solution was largely dismissed because it never actually explained how the immaterial thing could cause physical events. The interaction problem means the soul view leaves this enormous, unbridgeable gap in causality.
So if we can't explain how the soul interacts with the body, we can't really explain how it's managing the person's life across time.
Precisely. And then there's the psychological part. If your identity is anchored in something that is always the same, doesn't that inherently minimize how much a person can truly change?
That's the change problem.
Right. The soul view runs the risk of making these profound character transformations, like the moral shift of that reformed criminal we talked about, or overcoming a major psychological hurdle. It makes them seem secondary or superficial.
Like they're not core changes.
Exactly. If the essential core of you remains unchanged, does the depth of your human evolution, that radical shift in your values, or the complete rewriting of your personality, does that really count as a change in your identity? The idea of an unchanging substance can really struggle to account for the depth of personal transformation we all experience.
Okay, so if the immaterial substance is too elusive, maybe we have to admit that identity isn't something supernatural, but something concrete, something we can actually point to.
And that brings us to the most literal definition: the body.
The body view.
Or the biological organism view. This approach simplifies the issue quite a bit. It says you are the same person as long as your living physical body as one continuous organism persists through time.
But we know our matter is constantly in flux. We replace most of our cells every few years. So how can identity be anchored in a body that's made of fundamentally temporary material?
That's the key distinction. The body view isn't focused on molecular sameness, but on biological continuity. So while the individual atoms and molecules get replaced, the living system, the organism itself, remains functionally and structurally continuous. It maintains a stable, identifiable form, a metabolism, a life process throughout its entire lifespan. As long as that organism exists, it is you.
The strengths here seem pretty compelling. It aligns perfectly with just common sense identification. I see you on the street, I recognize you. And it's the foundation of how our practical society works.
It's incredibly pragmatic. It's what anchors our legal identity. Tracking citizens with DNA, fingerprints, birth records, medical histories. It gives us a clear, non-negotiable legal marker for who is who. In biological terms, it's simple. The organism lives, the person persists.
But the moment we bring the brain into the equation, the body view seems to run into immediate trouble, similar to the problems the soul view faced.
Absolutely. The brain transplant challenge is the immediate and most powerful counterargument. Imagine in the future a scenario where your functioning, conscious brain containing all your memories, your personality, your quirks, your ability to reason is transplanted into a new body, body B.
Okay.
Meanwhile, your original body, body A, is now brainless but kept alive on life support. Where did your identity go? Where are you?
Well, if the body view is correct, the person would have to remain with body A, the organism that has maintained that biological continuity.
Precisely. But the overwhelming intuition of almost everyone is that you followed the consciousness. The person in body B, with your brain, would wake up and insist, I'm me, I feel like me, I remember my whole life.
This suggests that identity, for most of us, is not primarily tethered to the rest of the physical organism.
It really isn't. If identity followed the organism, the transplant would just result in some new person with your memories trapped in a new body. But that isn't how we perceive the self at all.
That distinction between the biological organism and the conscious person seems to be the crucial point here.
It is, and it leads directly to the consciousness challenge. Think about people in a persistent vegetative state or a deep coma, or those with severe brain damage that results in a near-total loss of cognitive function. The biological organism is definitely still alive and continuous. We can track the DNA, the heart rate, the metabolic processes, but is it meaningful to say the same person, the conscious, thinking, desiring entity we associate with personhood, is still fully present?
The body view would have to insist that, yes, the person is still there because the organism is continuous. But our legal and ethical frameworks often treat that loss of consciousness as a loss of personhood, even if the body lives on.
And this just highlights that for identity to be meaningful, it often requires more than just mere biological survival. We feel this pull to move beyond simple matter and to start considering the inner life.
So we've tried to anchor identity in an immaterial soul and in a physical body, and both of them really struggle when you throw things like transplantation or amnesia or radical transformation at them. This strongly suggests that the answer has to lie somewhere in the realm of the mind.
And that leads us to what is probably the most influential approach in modern Western philosophy, the psychological continuity view.
This is an idea rooted in the work of John Locke, right?
Primarily, yes. It asserts that the inner life of a person matters far, far more than the spiritual or physical substance they happen to inhabit.
So this is the idea that who you are is defined by what you carry mentally.
Precisely. The core idea is that you are the same person if there's a chain of overlapping mental life and connection between the self at time A and the self at time B. Locke called this the continuity of consciousness, but modern thinkers have expanded the criteria beyond just simple memory.
Okay, so what are these essential criteria that make up the chain?
We can break it down into three key elements. First, and most famously, is memory. The crucial link is your ability to remember past experiences as your own. This memory is what connects your present conscious self to your past conscious self.
Locke argued that your identity extends as far back as your consciousness can reach.
Exactly. The second element is character traits and personality. There has to be some continuity in your recurring patterns of thinking, feeling, and acting. If your fundamental dispositions, your temperament, your moral compass, your typical emotional responses, if those are totally reversed, the continuity chain is seriously weakened.
And the third element?
Intentions and projects. This refers to the part of your mental life that stretches across time, giving your identity a forward momentum. It's your ability to maintain long-term goals, plans, and narratives. These are the threads you're constantly weaving into the future that define your psychological path.
I see how this works. You don't need to remember everything from when you were 5, but the person you are today remembers being the person you were yesterday, and yesterday's person remembered the day before that.
Creating a continuous, overlapping chain of consciousness.
Like a series of dominoes falling.
That's a perfect analogy. The chain doesn't need to be perfect, it just needs to be linked. And the compelling strength of this view is how perfectly it maps onto our emotional and relational understanding of who we are.
It explains why something like severe amnesia, or a devastating brain injury that alters someone's personality, feels like a complete breakdown of their identity, even if their body is totally untouched.
Yes. If your character and your ability to relate to your own past are gone, the you that matters feels like it's gone too.
It's a very intuitive view. It centers identity on our subjective experience. It justifies our daily belief that we are our minds, our memories, our capacity for reason and moral character. If we lose the mind, the person is often considered lost, regardless of the body's status.
But as we've learned, every powerful idea has to be stress tested. And the reliance on memory, which is what gives this view its strength, must also be its Achilles heel.
Right.
What's fascinating here is that the very foundation of this theory is made of inherently unreliable material human memory. And this is the core memory problem.
We know from so much psychological research that memory is incredibly selective. We are constantly, often subconsciously, editing our own histories to fit our current self-concept. We just filter out the embarrassing or contradictory stuff.
And it's not just selective, it's highly susceptible to suggestion and even outright false construction. The research by people like Elizabeth Loftus has shown just how malleable memory is. People can be convinced they remember events that never even happened.
So if our identity is anchored in a stream of consciousness and memory, and that memory is potentially false or heavily edited,
Then the identity it defines must also be, to some extent, fictional.
and what about just plain forgetting? If you forget a deeply important character-defining action from 10 years ago, maybe an act of cruelty or great kindness, do you, according to Locke's view, just stop being the person who did that thing?
That's the painful question the psychological view forces us to confront. If you take Locke literally, the person who forgets the action is no longer the moral subject of that past action. And this completely undermines the kind of moral continuity that society needs to function.
It suggests that if I'm only responsible for what I remember, I can just be forgiven for past sins by the grace of time and a bad memory.
Which is obviously a problem. And this fragility leads us right back into one of the most challenging philosophical traps, the problems that deal with duplication.
The duplication problem.
This is a critical test for sufficiency. So let's bring back the advanced sci-fi tech. Imagine a machine that can scan your entire mental life, every memory, every trait, every goal, and then flawlessly reconstructs it in two totally new biological bodies. Let's call them copy A and copy B.
Okay.
If the original you is destroyed in the process, the psychological view would dictate that both copy A and copy B have a 100% claim to being psychologically continuous with the person who existed a moment before the scan.
So by the psychological view's own definition, both A and B must be me.
Logically, yes, they are both psychologically continuous with you. But identity is fundamentally a one-to-one relationship. You can't be two people at the same time. So the fact that psychological continuity can be branched or duplicated proves something important. It proves that while continuity might be a necessary ingredient for identity, we need our memories to feel like ourselves, it might not be the sufficient condition. It doesn't guarantee you'll only be one person.
It reveals that the psychological view, for all its elegance, has to be secretly relying on some other form of singularity, maybe the body, or unique path of causation, to prevent identity from just dissolving into multiple simultaneous versions of itself.
Exactly. And finally, there's the gradual change problem. Identity change is rarely a sudden switch. It's a slow, continuous psychological drift. We all change a little bit every year.
So if identity is defined by the degree of psychological overlap, and that overlap is always partial, you're 95% the same as yesterday, maybe 70% the same as 5 years ago, and 30% the same as when you were a kid.
Then identity itself becomes messy, fluid, and graded.
It's not an all-or-nothing switch, it's a sliding scale.
And if it's a spectrum, where do we draw the line? Where does society draw the line and say, okay, this level of overlap is enough for identity, but this lower level is not? We want identity to be clear and categorical, but psychological change suggests it's actually ambiguous and relational.
The more we try to pin identity down to a fixed point, whether it's a soul, a body, or a mind, the more these intense, challenging puzzles just expose how slippery it is. Which means we have to dive into those classic philosophical thought experiments, the ones designed specifically to break our intuitions and push us towards these non-fixed concepts of identity.
Exactly.
Here's where it gets really interesting. We're moving away from the fixed theories and into scenarios that are designed to expose all the cracks in those theories. Let's start with the one that challenges our reliance on matter, the teleporter.
A classic, straight out of science fiction. You step into an advanced transportation device. It performs a flawless atomic-level scan of your body and your brain, recording every single informational state. Then, the original matter of your body is instantly destroyed, and an exact replica made of new matter, but with all your consciousness, memories, habits, and psychological contents perfectly intact, is reconstructed light years away on Mars.
The person on Mars wakes up, feels a bit disoriented, and thinks, I am me, I just teleported. Now, if we accept that the Mars copy is you, then we've basically concluded that psychological information and functional form matter infinitely more than the physical stuff you're made of.
That completely supports the psychological view.
It does.
That's the first conclusion, but the philosophical debate really heats up when you introduce the twist. What if the original body was not destroyed? What if the teleporter simply created the clone on Mars, while the original you stayed on Earth, maybe just sitting in the scanner, perfectly healthy?
Now we have two people, and both of them have a 100% claim to the memories, the psychological life, and the consciousness of the person who first stepped into the machine.
And this is where the psychological view just collapses because it can't select a singular outcome. If identity has to be one-to-one and now two of you exist, then either A, the original person ceased to exist the moment the split happened.
Or B, they are both you, which just violates the fundamental logic of identity.
But wait, if the original wasn't destroyed, why would the original cease to exist?
Gotcha.
Because the creation of that duplicate destroys the unique causal chain required for identity. If I know that my identity can just split and branch off, then the whole concept of my future self becomes meaningless. Identity requires that there be one single outcome that is me. The possibility of two outcomes means that whatever identity is, it can't just be psychological information that can be copied and pasted freely.
So the teleporter scenario forces us to look beyond just the data packets of our mind and back towards some kind of material or singular tether.
It does. And the brain split scenario presents a very similar dilemma, but it's rooted more concretely in advanced biology, forcing us to question the material limits of the self.
This thought experiment challenges our deepest intuition about being a single, unified person.
It really does. Imagine your corpus callosum. The structure that connects the two hemispheres of your brain is severed. Then, in some miraculous medical procedure, your brain is divided into its left and right hemispheres. Each half is then transplanted into a different waiting body. Let's call them left brain and right brain.
Okay.
Both of the resulting individuals wake up. They can talk, they can think, and crucially, both of them possess your complete set of memories and personality traits. They both feel like me. They both believe they have my past.
So are they both you?
This is what's called the fission problem. If you, the original person, survived the surgery, you must have survived as one of the two people, or maybe both of them. But if you survived as both, identity logic is broken. If you survive as only one, then which one and why? Was the person literally split in half? That just seems nonsensical.
The scenario strongly suggests that identity, the actual metaphysical fact of being the same person, it has to be an all-or-nothing affair. If a procedure results in two equally valid psychological claimants, the logical conclusion is often that the original identity just ceased to exist, giving way to two brand new people.
The brain split really shows the impossibility of fission when it comes to identity. Now, let's look at the classic analogy that's been debated since antiquity, which challenges our idea of continuity over time. The Ship of Theseus.
This has to be the most famous philosophical puzzle about change.
It is the perfect analogy for change over time in physical objects, which we then, of course, apply to ourselves. The scenario starts with a magnificent wooden ship, the pride of the fleet. Over years of service, the wood rots and the planks are replaced one by one. This happens systematically until every single original plank has been substituted with a new one.
Is the resulting ship still the same Ship of Theseus?
Most people intuitively say yes. It has the same continuous function, the same structure, the same name, the same historical narrative. It has functional continuity.
But here comes the brilliant twist.
The twist. What if someone meticulously collects all the discarded original planks, stores them in a warehouse, and then, using those very same materials, rebuilds them into the exact original form of the ship? Now we have two ships. Ship A, the one with continuous use and all new wood, and Ship B, the one built from all the original material. Which ship is the original Ship of Theseus?
Ship A has the continuous history, but Ship B has the continuous matter. This is where philosophers have to pick a side. Do we prioritize the continuity of the organism or function, which is Aristotle's view of form, or the continuity of the matter?
And when you apply this analogy to us, it's profoundly unsettling. We are constantly replacing ourselves, editing our memories, changing our values. Ship A is like our continuous biological organism, which remains the host speaker regardless of cellular replacement. Ship B is like a ghost of our past self, defined by the memories, values, or even the physical state we abandoned years ago.
The puzzle forces us to ask, at what point do we decide the self is defined by its continuous structure versus its continuous matter, and how do those two criteria clash within a single life?
These scenarios, the teleporter, the brain split, the Ship of Theseus, when you take them together, they synthesize this powerful counterargument to any fixed, rigid model of identity. They suggest that identity is less like a rigid line and more like a continuous, evolving, and sometimes even diverging pattern.
Which pushes us toward more radical views that actually embrace all this flux.
Once we accept the fluidity that these thought experiments reveal, we can move into more radical, process-oriented viewpoints. Let's start with the one that challenges the very Western premise of the singular I, the no-self perspective.
This view is most notably associated with Buddhist traditions, particularly the concept of amitta, or non-self. And it proposes that there is no permanent, substantial, unchanging self, soul, or ego that persists over time.
That is incredibly difficult for listeners who are raised in Western egocentric cultures to grasp. Our entire legal, psychological, and religious structure is built around the idea of a fixed I, the author of our intentions and the subject of our suffering.
And the no-self view just says that I is an illusion.
A powerful illusion, but an illusion nonetheless.
So how do they justify that if we so clearly feel continuous and singular?
They justify it through a rigorous analysis of change and impermanence. They use these powerful analogies. We are like a raging river. We give it a name, the Colorado River, and that name persists for thousands of years. But the water itself, the individual molecules that make up the river, is always flowing, always new, never identical to the water that passed a moment before.
So asking, am I the same person I was 10 years ago, is conceptually flawed from the start because the underlying reality is just constant flow.
Exactly. What we call the same person is not a fixed entity. It's a rapidly changing series of causally connected moments. In Buddhist philosophy, these are known as the five skandhas. Things like form, feeling, perception, mental formations, consciousness, which are always dissolving and reforming.
So identity over time, in this view, is about continuity and causality. The past causes the present, not about some absolute fixed sameness.
Right, and this means that while there's no static self at the center of it all, there's certainly a chain of consequences.
The actions, the causes, in one moment, have effects in future moments of that stream.
Absolutely. This view maintains ethical responsibility without needing a fixed substance. The present self has to deal with the consequences created by the past moments of the stream, and it has these profound ethical implications for ego attachment.
It's about reducing suffering.
Right. By recognizing the impermanence of the self, it naturally reduces our attachment to this fixed notion of me, the ego.
Yeah.
And that reduces the suffering that comes from clinging to something that is fundamentally changing. It emphasizes the radical potential for growth because there is nothing fixed holding you in place. You are liberated to change completely.
The no-self view is powerful, but maybe a bit too radical for navigating daily Western life. This seems to lead us to a middle ground that embraces change, but also imposes some structure. And that's the narrative view.
The narrative view, which was popularized by philosophers like Alasdair MacIntyre and psychologists like Jerome Bruner, is a very modern and accessible idea. It suggests that identity is not a substance, not a soul, not a body, not even a fixed mind, but is instead a constantly evolving, living story that you tell and live about yourself.
So we are both the author and the protagonist of our own evolving life story.
That's the metaphor. Your life forms a connected, cohesive story that stretches across time, and it integrates all the various crises, transformations, and successes into a meaningful whole. Continuity is maintained not by some fixed substance, but by the continuous, interpretive act of narration.
And how do we link those different moments together to keep the story continuous?
We rely on three key narrative acts, and these are acts of construction, not just retrieval. First is memory, where you explicitly state, that happened to me, and you integrate a past event into the plot of your life. Second is interpretation.
Okay.
This is where you impose meaning and shape. You define what past events meant and how they shaped the protagonist's journey. I failed at that job, which ultimately led me to this new, better path.
And finally, there has to be a future projection, right?
Exactly. Intention. This is where you project the story forward, defining this is the current chapter and this is where I'm going next. Your identity is the continuous, cohesive act of weaving these threads of past, interpretation, and future intention into a recognizable structure.
This view is incredibly helpful for resolving that linguistic paradox we started with.
It resolves it perfectly. The narrative view explained how someone can both accept responsibility for a terrible past event. It is my story, I am the protagonist, I own to that moment, while at the same time truthfully stating, I am no longer that person.
That past action was just a different chapter.
A different chapter, maybe a dark or a painful one, but the continuity of the book itself remains, bound by the overarching plot.
But stories are inherently subjective. This is where I have to push back a little. Doesn't that make identity seem too arbitrary? If I choose to frame myself as a perpetual victim, does that story just become my identity, even if others remember events differently, or if that framing is preventing me from growing?
That is the major challenge to the narrative view, what we can call the falsity and social challenge. Stories can definitely be distorted, idealized, or heavily biased to protect our current self-concept. We all tend to narrate ourselves as a bit better, more consistent, and more virtuous than we actually are.
Which raises the question, if identity is the story and the story is false, is the person also false?
It's a tricky one, and identity isn't solely self-authored, is it?
Not at all.
It's partly socially written. Other people tell stories about us. They define us by our roles, our perceived failures, our past actions. And those narratives can be extremely difficult to escape, especially in small communities. If the societal narrative clashes with your internal one, which one defines your identity?
And critically, things like severe trauma or illness or mental disorder can just profoundly shatter that coherent story, leaving people with this deep sense of fragmentation and a loss of self.
Which proves just how fragile the narrative mechanism can be.
But even with those challenges, the narrative view does offer this robust, flexible middle path. We are continuous, but we're not static. We are changing, but our changes aren't just random. We have structure without being trapped.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, we can start to synthesize a balanced conclusion. We can acknowledge that all of these views capture an essential, important dimension of the self that we have to respect.
So let's run through a summary of what each of these powerful viewpoints insists we pay attention to. Because it really feels like no single answer can satisfy the full complexity of being human.
I think that's right. If we look back, the soul view focuses our attention on this idea of deep sameness, that hypothetical, unchanging, and maybe spiritual core that's beneath all the surface flex.
Okay.
The body view offers that crucial biological anchor, the single continuous organism that society tracks legally and physically. And the psychological view emphasizes the overlapping mental life, that chain of memories, character, and intentions that we subjectively experience as our identity.
And what about the more radical, non-fixed views?
The no self or bundle views, they remind us of the chain of change, the fact that we are constantly flowing processes, not fixed objects. And that can be liberating. It frees us from stagnation. And finally, the narrative view highlights the evolving context, this idea of identity as a meaningful story we tell within a social and a temporal framework.
So we arrive at what seems to be the most complete, balanced answer. In reality, for all practical purposes, we are both the same person, and we are constantly becoming new ones.
That really is the synthesis. In the macroscopic sense, the legal, the biological sense, we are undeniably the same. You have one passport, one tax ID number, one medical history, one DNA profile. Society tracks a singular entity from birth to death.
Right.
But in the microscopic sense, the psychological, the character-based sense, we are absolutely not the same. Our neurochemistry changes, our beliefs get inverted, our desires shift, our social roles are replaced dramatically over the decades.
It brings us back to that powerful river analogy, which I think perfectly encapsulates this idea of continuities of change.
It really does. Think of the Mississippi River. It is consistently named the Mississippi River. Its geographical and historical identity is stable. It is the same river, and yet the water itself, the individual molecules that constitute the river, is always flowing and always new. The identity of the river resides in the continuous flow, the consistent banks, and the historical name, not in the water molecules themselves.
And we are the same. We are consistently named, we follow the continuous banks of a body, but the actual psychological material, the water, is always new. And understanding that we are the same river and ever new water at the same time has these profound, tangible implications for how we live our lives right now.
You can start with responsibility and future planning. Seeing yourself as fundamentally continuous encourages a deep ownership of your past actions, and it compels you to plan seriously for your future self. It forces you to invest in someone you genuinely believe you will become.
Whereas if you adopt the radical view that you're totally new all the time, you can risk this kind of existential drift, losing the ability to maintain deep commitments.
You can just disown the actions or failures of the previous person.
But on the other hand, recognizing the reality of radical change gives us profound space for growth and forgiveness.
It's the ultimate liberation. Recognizing that people can genuinely move into new chapters of their story allows us to extend empathy and forgiveness toward the past actions of others, knowing that deep transformation is actually possible.
And maybe more importantly, it lets us forgive ourselves.
Yes. Accepting the past person's mistakes without letting them entirely define the person you are actively building today. The past is not who you are, but it is part of the story that you tell.
And circling back to those long-term commitments, knowing that the future you will inevitably be a different person demands some careful prudence in your current actions.
It invites us to make promises carefully, understanding that our future self will need help honoring them. And this requires active, conscious design. You have to build habits, structures, and communities now that support the values and intentions of that future self.
You're essentially setting up the narrative so the next chapter flows logically from this one.
Exactly. You're making it easier for the person you become to keep the promises you made today.
And finally, whether you're on a path to seek an unchanging core, which is what a spiritual path often demands, or you're focused on transformation and seeing through the self's illusion, which is more of a psychological path, the way you understand identity fundamentally shapes how you suffer, how you connect, and how you grow.
The wisest stance, I think, in conclusion, is not to choose a single fixed anchor, but to recognize the dual nature of our existence, this continuity of change. I am responsibly connected to my past and my future selves. I own the story, but I am also capable of genuine, radical psychological change. I'm not trapped in who I was, but I also can't pretend that past person was someone else entirely.
We are, in a sense, the same river and ever new water at once.
So here's a final thought to leave you with. If your current beliefs and values dramatically conflict with your beliefs from 10 years ago, are you more obligated to honor a promise made by the person you were, or to honor the values held by the person you are now?